Hello, everybody. I'm Glenn Loury, host of The Glenn Show. I am Professor Emeritus of Economics at Brown University and Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I'm with Emily Skarbek. Emily is Associate Research Professor of Political Economy in the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University. She's an economist, trained at George Mason University's economics department with her PhD, and is an old friend and colleague of mine. We've been here at Brown University for the better part of 10 years together, and she and I have co-taught undergraduate course on race and inequality to scores of our Brown students and on two separate occasions. I value our friendship and our collegiality, and I welcome you, Emily, to the Glenn Show.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. It's great to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you. Now, I'm talking to you because of our mutual admiration and interest in admiration for and interest in the great economist, African-American as it happens. His name is Thomas Sowell. Tom is in his 90s. And is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he's been for 40 years plus. He's the author of many books. He is a theorist and philosopher, as well as a social scientist, social theorist, and social philosopher, as well as a social scientist. He's conservative. I don't think there's any getting around that. He's, in his way, a disciple of the great Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian economist, libertarian orientated. You correct me if I say any of this wrong, because you're an insider in this world. And I wanted to talk to Emily about Tom, about who he is to her, to you, Emily, and who he is to us. So if you're game, let's get going.
Yeah.
You asked if I couldn't arrange it that this conference that's going to take place in October, celebrating the life and work of Thomas Sowell, if you and your husband, David Skarbek, a political scientist of some distinction, couldn't get invited to the conference. Why would you want to travel all the way across the country to sit in a conference room and listen to a bunch of talks about a 95-year-old economist?
Well, good reason. I mean, Thomas Sowell is a fascinating, figure of the 20th century. I mean, as you mentioned, he's a brilliant social theorist. He's an economist, but he's also been a very outspoken public intellectual. You call him a conservative, but also, kind of classical liberal stripes. That's kind of mainly how I would paint F.A. Hayek as being kind of in the broad tradition of kind of classical liberalism. So he's a fascinating character for a number of different reasons, and someone who I've read throughout my life, who's had influence on my own ideas, my own ways of thinking about the social world, about the economy, about economics in general. And so he's somebody who's worth engaging with and reading his work and celebrating in terms of the contribution that he's made to kind of public intellectual life and just kind of the general economics specifically.
What's the difference between a conservative and a classical liberal?
Well, that could take us down a long path in terms of kind of tossing that out. But I think, Hayek wrote an article called "Why I'm Not a Conservative" after he published his big book, The Constitution of Liberty, because it was famously held up by conservatives like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as a playbook for kind of this neoliberal set of policy agendas. But Hayek wrote an essay saying why I'm not a conservative. And one of the things that I think is interesting in distinguishing classical liberals from conservatives is that he proposes kind of trying to understand a structure for the social world, which allows for kind of the greatest amount of values and expressions of individual agency to be fulfilled within kind of the open society. And so part of that argument that Hayek advances there is about social institutions that are evolutionary, that are grounded in tradition, but evolve and change, and should evolve and change to meet kind of new circumstances and kind of new problems as time unfolds. And so, in that respect, there are certain aspects of Hayek's thought that is about conserving different types of institutions that he thinks are fundamental to supporting kind of the broad liberal market order, but at the same time recognizes that there should be scope for a whole host of human values to be able to flourish and find their full expression. And so I think in that respect, he's certainly not as backwards looking in terms of thinking about preserving tradition strictly for tradition's sake.
Okay, so the emphasis is on liberty, not on reproducing or holding on to inherited practice and institution. But there is a case in Sowell, is there not, for a kind of reverence or deference in the face of inherited practice and tradition? And that does have, I'm trying to defend my use of the word conservative, kind of, doesn't it not, conservative implication? I mean, it's a skepticism in the face of every fad and fancy that comes along. We want to remake our practice yet anew because we are the generation of today. And I think there is, isn't there, in Thomas Sowell and also in Hayek, a sense that, well, not so fast with that.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there in both Sowell and Hayek's work. The one is this understanding about traditions, customs, culture as embodying knowledge and practice over time. So Hayek's made this article in several places, but it's a theme that Sowell picks up on and really expands on and expounds on in a variety of different ways about how it is that certain types of legal institutions and cultural practices can embody wisdom of the past. And so those practices may persist even though the uses for those practices are no longer relevant. But also the case that those practices can embody much more knowledge than what we might be able to design kind of anew. And so there's a certain deference to kind of respecting the fact that there's embodied knowledge in these evolutionarily evolved rules that may be a greater than what we can kind of design anew. That said, there's a question about what the substance of those rules is actually preserving and perpetuating. And that, I think, both Sowell and Hayek are open to this idea about um, rules and institutions as being flexible to accommodate and to adjust for ever-changing circumstances. Sowell makes a point of kind of reiterating this over time, is that what we want are sets of institutions that um, respond to feedback and changes in kind of the external environment in ways that perhaps preserve some of the substance of those rules that we find useful and valuable, but are also able to accommodate kind of new and novel scenarios.
Yeah, I've been reading some of the criticism that has arisen around the work that Thomas Sowell is famous for. And one of the constant themes there is that he underestimates the um, importance of challenging structures of power and domination that are historical, uh, like you know, residue of the past. Uh, and you think of the liberation of women, and you think of various ethnic and racial domination. You think of the colonial legacy and hierarchies that have been passed down across the decades and the centuries. And I wonder whether you think that's a fair criticism of Thomas Sowell and also of Friedrich von Hayek.
So I think that there's certainly scope for leveling those criticisms. I think any kind of, well, let me back up. Yes, I do think that there's some kind of scope for those criticisms. But I also think that kind of these types of arguments where you're kind of starting from kind of a position in history will be kind of subject to those criticisms regardless of what point in history we're at. So there's always the problem that we start with the status quo, and the status quo comes with kind of the legacies of history. Um, that doesn't mean that there isn't scope for kind of addressing those types of problems and challenges as questions of domination and power and historical dominance. And I think that those criticisms have been leveled at Sowell and at Hayek, and they're difficult to kind of maneuver away from, given some of their other ideological commitments and analytical commitments as well.
Who funds the news outlets that you rely on? What agendas shape their coverage? How accurate have they been in their reporting in the past? If you want to know the answers to these questions, I suggest you check out Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and to get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. About 20 such stories every day. Here, for example, is a story covered by the left, but not by the right. Israel labeled 4,500 detained Gaza civilians as unlawful combatants, report finds. And here's the reverse. This is covered by the right and ignored by the left. Russia expects ongoing Ukraine talks tied to territorial changes, Lavrov says. For both of these and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. So make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
So you would consider yourself to be a classical liberal, would you?
Mm-hmm.
And you are part of a community of economists and fellow travelers who are agreed upon these philosophical premises?
Well, I mean, I don't know who's in my tribe and who's not in my tribe, but I know what I believe.
Well, I mean, we're both economists here, you and I, different generations, but it's the same field. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I've been forced to ask myself as I immerse myself in Sowell's corpus in preparation for this conference, what's the difference between his training and practice of economics and my own? And I'm not counting books now because he's way, way, way ahead. And I'm not going to pretend that, that I've been anything nearly as productive, but I have been trained. I was trained at MIT. I was trained in a certain way of thinking about economic analysis and economic theory, about the use of evidence, about formal modeling, about the role of government, about planning, and so on. And it's a very different school of thought. And I gather that your school of thought and his have a good deal more in common. I'm just kind of asking for your perspective.
Yeah.
You'll recall that conference that Pete Betke came to here at Brown that our friend Daniel D'Amico organized, and my interventions, which I wish I could take some of them back now because I think they weren't entirely respectful, but they did give voice to this idea. The Journal of Political Economy, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and Econometrica know what they're doing and know what they're talking about, and they deserve to be at the forefront of the discourse in economic science. Note, economic science. A lot of people would object to that. And I gather that Pete professor at George Mason and someone whom I have a lot of respect for and a very impressive person intellectually and personally, I would take a different view. So anyway, I'm asking you to wade in a little bit to that.
Yeah. So Pete Boettke was my dissertation supervisor at George Mason when I came to do my PhD there in 2004. And I came to do my PhD at George Mason precisely because I was interested in Hayek. I was interested in some of these ideas. And I, found out as an undergraduate that I was pretty good at economics. And so, that kind of took me on that course to doing a PhD there at George Mason. And it was a wonderful experience. But one of the ways that connects up with the ideas of Sowell was kind of the influence of one of my professors at George Mason, which was Walter Williams. Walter Williams was an institution at George Mason University. I don't think I'm underestimating it at all by kind of his stature and his presence were very well known. I believe Walter Williams came to George Mason in 1980 when he started teaching, and he was known for being the mainstay of teaching the microeconomic theory course. This was the course that all of the graduate students had to take. And he taught it very much in the style of what he referred to which was UCLA price theory. Okay? And so microeconomics today, most places where it's taught as micro. But for Williams, it was very much a price theory course.
People are not going to know the difference between those two, but I don't want to get you off track.
Well, price theory is basically microeconomics without the game theory focus. It's focused on the logic of choice, choice behavior and price formation, the operation and importantly of competition within kind of the price formation and adjustment process. And it's a focus primarily on like a partial equilibrium analysis. So kind of stepping away from the larger general equilibrium kind of framework. That's how I would think about it. So it's basically, applied micro. But Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell were close friends, and they were close friends for over 50 years. And what's very interesting about them, they share some very interesting characteristics and similarities, both in terms of their background, but also in the ways in which they approach doing and thinking about economics. So I would classify both Walter and Tom Sowell as price theorists. They use the tools of kind of basic choice analysis with a heavy emphasis on how the institutions and the rules of the game shape and inform that choice process. So, with kind of a more Chicago approach would emphasize kind of the formal comparative statics approach, something that you would be familiar with like Gary Becker. Whereas, the way Walter Williams would approach kind of the UCLA style approach, which would be to kind of place more of an emphasis on property rights and how institutions and contractual structures align incentives between agents. And then there's like the broader Austrian framework, which I think is consistent with this, which is kind of an approach that emphasizes the subjective nature of costs, the subjective nature of choice, and the process of agents trying to undertake their own plans and purposes, and the market prices providing the mechanism for coordinating those plans and purposes, both in kind of space and time. And so one of the things that's very interesting about Sowell and Sowell's work is that he kind of takes up this, subjectivist turn in much of the ways in which he presents his basic economics. And that's kind of on full display in the first section of Knowledge and Decisions.
Yeah, which is a master class in applied economic analysis, I think. We're talking about the book Knowledge and Decisions. I just happen to have it here. And Thomas Sowell, but we're also talking about Walter Williams. And I will tell you a story about Walter Williams, who was a loquacious, compelling personality, tall and lean. He also was Black. I just don't want to have that fact get mentioned because the idea that he was the guru of price theory at a first-rate economics department and was an institution there loved and feared, I would have to assume, by his students, pleases me. I have to tell you that thought free. But the story is, I was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Walter was living at that time in Philadelphia and teaching at Temple, if I am not mistaken, Temple University. And he made a point of making contact with us, and we had dinner together. He and his wife, me and my late wife, Linda, at that time. And he cajoled and regaled and embarrassed and confronted me on my apostasy because I wasn't practicing Christ theory and whatnot. I was spending way too much time proving theorems, mathematical I dotting and T crossing, than I was doing, quote, real economics, close quote. And that rebuke still rings in my ears now, decades later. But, he was a great man, no doubt, and a good friend of Tom Sowell and a teacher of yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as I was mentioning, that there's some parallels across their careers. I mean, as you mentioned, they're both Black men who came of age before the civil rights movement kind of came to fruition. They both had kind of interesting, similar backgrounds in terms of growing up in urban environments, raised primarily by women. They attended public high school and both excelled very well over the course of their studies and their education, all the way through their PhDs. And they both they were drafted into the military. Walter Williams, I believe, in the late 1950s, and Sowell was drafted as a Marine in the Korean War. And so they both have kind of a very interesting kind of experience as they're coming up through their PhDs. And as their career unfolds, they both kind of take a turn that's, decidedly different from the mainstream of the profession. I mean, both wrote books in plain English. They didn't find formalism useful, particularly in communicating a lot of their ideas, although both had some pretty formative papers earlier in their career. They used economic theory to kind of illuminate practical problems. They both found it important and meaningful to communicate to the widest audiences, kind of the basics of economics. And so they did this in writing books for the public, but also in nationally syndicated columns and radio shows before there were podcasts. And in kind of making regular public commentary. And I think there's something quite interesting and important about that kind of public intellectual engagement that both Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell were masters of.
I'm interested in hearing what you think about that. I recall Walter Williams having the role of substituting for Rush Limbaugh, the late epic. He wasn't a podcaster, he was a broadcaster, Rush Limbaugh, with a huge following. And Walter Williams would take over his microphone when Rush would have the week off for whatever reason from time to time, with a massive national audience. So he was no small potatoes in that regard. But why do you think that's important for an economist to be doing?
Well, to be fair, not all economists are going to do that. I believe in specialization and division of labor. But I really think that the kind of ideas that both Walter Williams and Tom Sowell would express were ideas that they thought would empower the layman, the everyday individual, to make better sense of the political economy around them, to be better engaged citizens in terms of being knowledgeable about kind of basic economic propositions, about how the market worked, about how it is that we should think about the costs of various types of government intervention. And I think that they saw part of what they were doing is providing an important general education to educated and interested people to kind of enhance their capacities as citizens.
Well, I like to think of myself as trying to follow in their footsteps in that regard to a certain degree, although, again, with modesty. I was struck in reading the 1996 edition's preface to Sowell's epic work, Knowledge and Decisions. Him reflecting back on the book was published in 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. The Reagan era through the 80s was accompanied by shifts in the direction of a more friendly, open, free market kind of political sensibility in a number of countries around the world. Margaret Thatcher in the UK comes to mind immediately. And Tom Sowell, in the 1996 preface, reflecting back on his book, great book, Knowledge and Decisions, originally published in 1980, kind of asked the question whether he was too pessimistic in 1980 about the future of liberty. And so Reagan's ascendance and influence in the global conversation about government and freedom gave him reason in 1996 to be optimistic. And I want to ask you, Emily Skarbek, whether or not here in 2025, we can continue to be optimistic about the prospects for liberty, or whether, I don't know, Zohran Mamdani likely to be the next mayor of New York City. And I'm just citing him because he comes to mind and he's in the news right now, but he's just one indication of the fact that I don't know if liberty is winning or losing. And I'm trying to ask you what you think about that.
If liberty is winning or losing?
Whether the optimism that Sowell evidences in 1996, looking back on the 80s, is something that you could endorse here in 2025.
I don't think so. I think that, in many ways, Sowell's reflections at that time were probably, much more optimistic than I can be right now. It's, one of my professors, James Buchanan, who was notably pretty pessimistic about kind of the change in the ability to kind of advance liberty going forward. He used to say something along the lines of, he's pessimistic looking forward, but optimistic looking backwards. And right now, I feel very pessimistic looking forward because we have a lot of challenges that we're facing to our institutions that I think can undermine liberty going forward. I think a lot of the policies that are being pursued by the current administration are increasing uncertainty and diminishing trust in kind of key institutions. And I think by doing those types of moves, the administration's gaining very little and costing us a great deal in terms of the strength and quality of our institutions over time. I mean, that's one of the kind of themes that Sowell would kind of continuously go back to, is just the fundamental importance about the relationship between the types of institutions and the types of decisions that are made in various different arenas of society. And I think we're going through a period right now in which a lot of uncertainty and chaos is being kind of thrown into how it is that these locuses of decisions are shifting, mainly due to a lot of the executive actions that have been taken by President Trump.
Okay, well, there's President Trump, and the list of missteps and disconcerting departures from institutional stability is a long list. I agree. There's reason to be concerned. You fired the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I mean, have you any idea what that does to the integrity of the information system that we all depend upon, sir?
Yeah.
You think you can just decapitate the Federal Reserve Board chairman because you want a different monetary policy? Again, have you any idea of the long-term implications of undermining a sense of integrity to the monetary policy-making process, and so on and so forth? There is Trump, and I agree there's reason for concern, but I was thinking about, well, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The West of liberty, freedom, free market, neoliberalism won the Cold War. The globalization process is well advanced, and the market is expanding into corners of the human civilization that had heretofore been outside of its orbit. And I was thinking about that on the one hand. I was thinking, yeah, capitalism, much reviled by some on the left, is nevertheless the only show in town. And that would seem to militate in favor of optimism from the point of view of a classical liberal. That's a question, but then I was also thinking about, and I'm not picking on Mr. Mamdani. He's a young fellow. He's going to be the next mayor of New York, it would appear. Rent control, minimum wage, public grocery stores, free transit, whatever. And these ideas are popular in many quarters, you know? They get people elected. Sowell goes on and on and on about, and Hayek in a high philosophical fashion before him, about the emptiness of the category of social justice. Well, try telling that to somebody knocking on doors in New Hampshire during a presidential primary campaign. They don't know what you're talking about. The minimum wage is a foregone thing. It should be $25 an hour. I keep telling people, let's make it 50. Who can live on $25 an hour? Let's make it 50. The absurdity of which underscores the basic price theory point that you can't just legislate higher productivity for people and expect that to work. But in any case, I go on. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. I mean, I think that, there's a couple of points to respond to. I mean, I think that, you know, Sowell would have his hands full in terms of dealing with all of the kind of fallacies involved in each one of those policies. And in fact, you can find him kind of giving examples throughout Knowledge and Decisions about, the fallacies involved there. But in terms of kind of optimism for the future, I mean, I think that I describe myself as a classical liberal, and it's, interesting because, the politics that I grew up with, at least the politics prior to 2000 aughts, the right and left shared some liberal commitments, some basic kind of commitments to liberalism. Whereas I think with the political realignment that we've seen towards kind of populism, both on the left and the right, it's kind of been joined with a movement away from those shared liberal principles, whether you be on the right or the left. And so there seems to be kind of a post-liberal sentiment, or kind of an illiberalism that has gripped some of the kind of far wings of both the right and the left. And I find that to be particularly troubling in light of, kind of a prior state in which at least the left and the right in the US used to share some commitments to kind of broad liberal principles. I see the tendency for those kind of populist extremes to kind of turn their attention towards the breaking down of some of those liberal institutions and norms, and I think is worrisome for the future. So that's why I suggest some pessimism going forward, because I think we need those shared liberal commitments, regardless of where we kind of stand politically.
I like that thought of distinguishing between a kind of partisan difference about the size of the welfare state, or how much to worry about poverty or whatever on the one hand, and a endorsement of institutions that are the foundation for the preservation of liberty and for the achievement of a well-ordered society, which is kind of above, is it not, the debate about how much the budget should be, and how much healthcare should be subsidized and things like that. So I like that. I want to ask about something else in the context of knowledge and decisions, and that's about the role of experts. I'm still chafing, I don't know about you, in my recollection of the COVID pandemic and how we managed it, and the extent to which that connects with some of the themes in knowledge and decisions. What do you think about that? Do you think that Sowell's concern about people making choices that govern our lives from on high based upon articulated expertise as opposed to decentralized based upon the wisdom of the individuals in their local circumstance is relevant in our postmortem on COVID, or what?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's important. I mean, so Soul distinguishes, in the beginning of the book, he talks about there's different types of knowledge, the articulated or abstract knowledge of intellectuals, as you mentioned, but also kind of the practical on the ground knowledge, the knowledge of time and place, sometimes tacit knowledge, but also knowledge of like very particular kind of ways of organizing economic activity. I mean, a manager on the ground at a particular location at a particular store might have some very, insightful knowledge about how to organize production kind of within that local facility. And what Soul draws out is that that's just a different type of knowledge. And there isn't kind of one spectrum of knowledge, but there's various different types of knowledge. And Soul kind of starts off by suggesting that we implicitly tend to give deference or favor to this highly abstract and articulated expertise knowledge. And in many domains, that's absolutely correct, right? If I'm going to have a surgeon come and operate on me, I want them to be the best surgeon that they can possibly be. I want them to have the expertise for the type of surgery that I'm going to undertake. But, you know, one of the kind of frustrations that Soul kind of draws attention to is this kind of attention and deference to this one special type of specialized knowledge at the expense of acknowledging the role that all of these other different types of knowledges play in the kind of grand scheme of things. And so there's a theme that Soul runs with that shows off his kind of fundamental kind of frustration with the type of abstract knowledge that experts hold that's divorced from experience, it's divorced from know-how, it's divorced from the types of feedback mechanisms that can basically sort out between, true and good and wise information and that which may not be kind of tested empirically, that may not be accurate, that may not be reflective of time and place circumstances. And so I think that, when Sowell's critiquing a lot of this use of expertise and knowledge, he's putting his finger on something incredibly important about how it is that when we substitute different types of decision makers and different types of domains, we should expect that they're going to draw on different types of knowledge and generate different types of results. And so I think his critique of some of that use of expertise and knowledge is incredibly important, but it's also important to recognize that it's against a backdrop of an understanding of the market as a mechanism for generating and communicating knowledge in a way that's oftentimes and in certain respects comparable to the use of expertise knowledge. I don't know if that was too abstract in kind of answering your question.
Well, not for me, and I'm hoping not for the audience, but let me stir the pot a little bit. Public goods, you do public finance. It's a part of your academic expertise and economics. I'm thinking about climate change, and I'm thinking about pandemics. So the scientist, the expert with the articulatable kind of abstract knowledge is going to tell us, to the best of his or her ability, the implications of certain industrial practices for the content of the atmosphere and the consequences of that for climate and, short-term, long-term and all of that. And the expert analyst of data and, can get the discount rate right and write down the dynamic programming model is going to tell us the financial implications of this or that remedy for the climate externalities, and what it implies about taxes and living standards and so forth and so on. And there's no way to manage the problem, is there, without reliance upon that kind of expertise, and moreover, without planning, without centralized authority, laying down guidelines, imposing strictures, formulating policy, and so forth and so on. Likewise, in a context of a pandemic, the epidemiologists are going to be the ones we rely on to inform us about the consequences of this or that practice. People may have a gut feeling that closing the schools is not a good idea. It's not good for children. They certainly should be listened to, but that the consequences of getting that one wrong could be catastrophic, and expertise plays a role there. So, how do you react to this kind of evocation of the essential necessity of deference to expertise in the face of the kinds of collective action, disaster type risking problems that I was just describing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I take Sowell to kind of suggest two kind of ways of thinking about this question. The first is always from kind of a comparative institutional perspective. So, the question is, what types of institutions should we have the federal government making decisions about face mask policies that are universal to all of the states, or should we have the states each making their own policies about masking and allow that to happen on kind of a lower level of decision making? I think, the kind of comparative institutional point that Sowell raises is, for what types of problems, what are the available like alternatives of ways in which we could deal with this? And we'd like to try to utilize the types of institutions that are flexible and that are able to kind of incorporate feedback, and also bring the decision makers as close to the ground of the problem as the problem requires. So, obviously, with things like pandemics, with things like climate change, the very nature of their externalities generates kind of a larger scope for decision making. But I think that would be the way that he would be approaching those questions, is a kind of in a comparative institutional perspective. The second point that I took away from Sowell is always to ask the question, not just like as compared to what, but what are the trade-offs involved? So when we were going through COVID, most of the advice that came from epidemiologists, that came from a lot of these experts, didn't incorporate what the relevant trade-offs would be. It's always spoken about as being a necessity, or being the only course of action.
The solution.
I'm sorry?
As Sowell would put it, the solution.
The solution, and yeah.
Not the trade-off, but the solution. Not
Yeah,
the incremental improvement, but the absolute conquering of the problem.
And this is kind of endemic across many different domains of social problems, of thinking about things as a war on poverty, or the war on drugs, or kind of any social policy in which we're not 100% successful represents a failure, and an ability to do we can do more. So Thomas Sowell would always emphasize that there's trade-offs involved. And if we're not acknowledging what those trade-offs are, we're not even at the first step of making kind of a reasonable approach to evaluating these types of questions. And I think that was a big problem with expertise during COVID, is that there was there was very little and effort to even recognize what some of the trade-offs would be, or that they would be reasonable trade-offs. Particularly when we talked about policies with regard to students and children going to school. I mean, that was a case in which the costs of keeping students out of the classroom, especially young children who had a very low chance of contracting the virus, those costs were incredibly high, and they were ignored for a long period in the public policy discussions about, what the kind of appropriate measures to take were in these circumstances. So I think, we would have been better off if we were asking more questions from Thomas Sowell about what the trade-offs actually entail, who's bearing those costs, and who's making the decision about whether or not those costs are worthy to bear.
Well, that is one of his points, isn't it, about how it's really more important to ask who's deciding with what constraints and incentives than it is to talk about the content of the decision itself. The process is really where all the action is. Um, Now, in the climate change area, it occurred. I was going to just briefly summarize what I heard you say a moment ago, which is diversity of the decision making, because it's at a lower level of, uh, uh, it's not one size fits all. Experiment that permits experimentation, which permits learning and feedback, so that decision makers can adjust their policy in the face of what the evidence seems to show. Um, but I was also thinking about the coordination across international boundaries of policies, like having to deal with climate change, where you do have a certain game theoretic situation where it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma type situation, tragedy of the commons. And that got me to thinking about the global community as opposed to the national community, and whether or not the sort of philosophical ideas of classical liberalism have any traction at all in trying to think about international relations and whatnot. I know that's not your area of expertise, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that at all.
Well, I mean, I think that what we're doing right now, what the administration is doing right now in terms of upending our global order of trade, uh, in
Oh, the
terms
tariffs.
with the tariffs, yeah. And not just with the tariffs, but with, again, to the extent that you think that many of these actions that are being taken on the part of the administration are undermining the confidence in kind of the US government more generally, I think we should be really worried about those things, particularly because they're often kind of not the types of things that we can see, um, you know, um, happening until they're kind of diminishing and having an impact. So yeah, I think in terms of the international situation, Trump's creating a lot of uncertainty. I think he's doing he's trading off very short term gains for losses in kind of long term trust. And I think that in terms of the global economic order, we've seen so much economic integration, and I think that there's just even more, gains to be had in terms of kind of free and open trade. So, to the extent that Trump has at least turned the rhetoric to where perhaps people on the left and the center and the mid right are now thinking that free trade probably isn't such a bad thing after all, perhaps that's a cause for optimism going forward. But I don't think that the games that he's playing in terms of wrecking uncertainty in terms of global economic exchange is good for the U.S., but good for the world.
Okay, so I'm going to invoke fair trade, not free trade, because the free trade is leading to the disadvantage of our side. That it's a game. It's not a perfectly competitive situation, and their strategic considerations matter. And you try to throw your weight around to your advantage. The best hand doesn't always win in poker. Sometimes you bluff and you get to take the pot. That this kind of faith in laissez-faire is going to lead to the best of all possible worlds is belied by the history where shrewd actors, the Chinese national government's economic policies and so forth take advantage of people who are not strategic, and that it's a game. It's price theory isn't going to be my guide here because I've got a small number and I've got the conflicting interest and overlapping influences and all of that kind of thing. It's a negotiation. The person gets closer to their ideal point if they are shrewd and ruthless in the way they conduct themselves, something like that. No?
Well, I mean, there could be some kind of strategic, gamesmanship going on here for things that are other than that for which the trades of goods and services are just kind of collateral damage. That might be the case, but in terms of creating the conditions for long run prosperity and you know um, freedom, I don't think that pursuing mercantilist policies that essentially, setting off a strategic trade war is going to be zero sum for all players involved. Whereas the alternative, in terms of lowering trade restrictions and allowing for a greater volume of international trade, is not a zero sum game. That's kind of, a positive sum game in which there's the potential for even increasing returns. And so I think the kind of the trade war only works to, if it sets off a trade war, then it's a lose-lose situation across the board. Whereas, if we can avoid that in one way or another, then we're going to be better. Everyone's going to be better off. And so that's the real tragedy of if we kind of go down this route of really closing off economic integration. It's going to have kind of two effects. One is we're going to be poorer as a result of it, but two, if we continue to undermine the institutions that create the conditions under which we can have that type of exchange, then we're going to be impoverished in ways that have long and lasting effects for kind of generations. So I think it's that recognition that the market doesn't operate independently of the sets of institutions which are there to foster that exchange. And Sowell was very well aware of this. I mean, one of the things that's super interesting about him is that he did his PhD actually in kind of the history of economic thought, which you can't do today. But when he goes to write with Stigler, he follows Stigler to Chicago. He does so because he's writing a dissertation mainly on classical political economy. And one of the ideas that he takes from classical political economy is that you don't just get markets to work in a vacuum. They require the sets of institutions that kind of the classical political economists focused on, which things like, property rights, rule of law, contract, transfer by consent, the rule of law. And if you don't have those institutions, none of the propositions that Adam Smith makes about the market being able to satisfy consumer wants and to maximize the social surplus, none of that stuff happens if you don't have the right sets of institutions. And so one thing that's really interesting to me about Sowell is just how deeply he appreciated this. So it's not so much just that it was kind of free trade in favor of free trade, but in recognition that there's this kind of intricate relationship between our social institutions and the prospects for prosperity.
I want to ask you as we get to the end of the hour about the future of classical liberalism. I mean, Sowell is 95 years old, if I got that correct. Hayek is no longer with us. James Buchanan is no longer with us. And I can't see anybody doing that kind of stuff, getting the Nobel honor that Hayek and Buchanan enjoyed in their time. That's at the report. I doubt that Tom will ever be so recognized, even though I think he's very much deserving. And who are the young classical liberals like yourself of note whom we should keep our eye on going forward?
I mean, I don't know. So I can give you a couple of names of people who I think are doing really particularly interesting work, and that I think that there's probably more out there than I know. I'll just say as kind of a prefatory note, I mean, classical liberalism for me involves, I take my kind of center from Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. So I'm grounded in, ancient history, so to speak, in terms of, my politics have very little to do with, kind of contemporary politics of the day. But what I find, enduring about those ideas is a focus very much on kind of Scottish Enlightenment values, values about how we treat human dignity, um, values about how it is that we should, we can think about the importance of institutions in our world for creating a society that lifts up the least well off. I think, classical liberalism always has its concern primarily focused with prosperity for all and prosperity for the least well off. So it's those kind of values that I think, the free market aspect of that, and much of my kind of social liberalism kind of is embodied in the kind of classical liberalism. But what I mentioned earlier, what I'm concerned with is that there's fewer and fewer people who are sharing some of those kind of core liberal values, and I think those are liberal values that people who are kind of Democrats or Republicans should reinvest in. So I think that that's actually really, really important in terms of the young classical liberals who are doing great work and doing great things. There's a great project that's being undertaken right now by a professor named Bart Wilson, who's doing work to kind of reimagine economics from the perspective of taking humans as humans. So he calls his project Humanomics, and it's very much based in kind of an Adam Smithian perspective of human agency. So I think he's doing incredible work. There's political theorists like John Thrasher, who just moved to Ohio State University, who's doing excellent work on liberalism, and Adam Smith as well. But there's a variety of different economists who have come through George Mason, who are doing excellent work in terms of teaching at universities across, across the U.S. And teaching economics very well, with an eye to kind of communicating with the public in ways that are much better than I can do. But yeah, I think that classical liberalism and libertarianism always has been a very small percentage of kind of the ideas that are out there, and I think an even smaller percentage of the ideas that are out there in academia. And so, while there's few of us, we are mighty.
The Mont Pelerin Society. What is it?
The Mont Pelerin Society was an academic society that was founded, you'll test me, I think it was 1947, post-war scenario in which you had classical liberals, in particular economists and social philosophers, that kind of came together in the wake of World War II, looking out on the world and seeing a very dark and bleak place. They saw a place where collectivism was on the rise, where fascism was in season, where nationalizations were happening in countries like the UK, and they saw the classical liberal ideas threatened. And so the Mont Pelerin Society was formed. You had kind of people like Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Karl Popper, George Stigler, among the many of kind of the early founders who came together to try to create a professional society for keeping these ideas both alive, but also testing their relevance and applying them to new topics, and trying to kind of think about what a liberal kind of social world could look like in the face of all of the devastation that was brought after World War II. And so that was how Mont Pelerin Society was founded. It was very small at the time. They debated a whole bunch of academic questions. They were debating very, kind of different types of like policy approaches to dealing with monopolies, to dealing with all kinds of problems with business cycles, with nationalizations. And so within the group, it was actually pretty, varied in terms of the types of ideas that they were bringing to the table, the types of discussions that they were having over economic policy, but all shared this kind of commitment to what a vision for kind of a renewed exuberance for liberal ideas, and in particular, classical liberal and free market ideas, how they could inform the countries of the West going forward.
It's still active.
Still active today. I was at a regional meeting several years ago. I'm not actually a member, but I've attended a handful. I've spoken at Mont Pelerin Society meetings. But it's still active, and the core of the idea is still there, with the notion of being a place for people of like-minded ideas, like classical liberalism and free market ideas, can come together and engage in discussion about social issues and the ways forward that can enhance kind of liberty and a positive vision for the future.
Okay. You got anything you want to add to this discussion before we close?
This has just been really exciting to talk to you about some of these ideas. I guess I'd kind of like to hear, maybe if you don't mind me asking you on the subject of classical liberalism, where you think you depart from calling yourself a classical liberal.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that throughout this whole conversation. And so we did price theory when I was in graduate school for a half of a semester. And then we went to game theory and related methodological enthusiasms. And I found myself to be pretty good at it. So I like writing down models, and I like dotting I's and crossing the T's and solving. And sometimes to the extent that it departs from John Cochrane. John Cochrane, the economist at Stanford, he wrote a review of my memoir, Late Admissions. And he asked the question, because I was born in Chicago within a stone's throw of the university, but I ended up at MIT. And I ended up there because my teachers, as an undergraduate at Northwestern University, where I did my BA, said, don't go to Chicago. They're all conservatives over there. So I went over to MIT, where they're Keynesian progressives who could take me under their wing. And John says, I wonder who Glenn would have been if he had gone to Chicago instead of MIT. Both methodologically, he would have been a lot more empirical and a lot more focused on economic history and institutions than on abstract models about angels on the head of a pin. And he probably would have been more conservative. He might have fitted in there very well. I'm intrigued and enthused a little bit by the classical liberal corpus, as I understand it. I have not read 3 volumes of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, but I've read a fair amount of Hayek. I've read his book on the fallacy of the idea of social justice. And of course, I've read The Road to Serfdom when I was in college, and have a great appreciation of that. But I'll tell you, the race question kind of throws me for a loop. And I didn't get to ask you about that. You and I taught together for 2 years on race and inequality. The idea that government is not necessarily the solution, and that the market is not necessarily the enemy. I get that. I'm with Sowell. I'm with Becker. I think, price theory has a lot of insights about. I'm with James Heckman, who says you don't do audit experiments and draw a conclusion, because the market is actually going to lead to a matching process that is not captured in the auditing And so I don't think the market is necessarily the enemy of racial minorities. On the other hand, I think the identity questions and the kind of formation of a sense of self and the narrative questions and the political economy of identity and whatnot. I'm not embracing laissez-faire 100% with respect, and I still want to fight for my people. Okay, so nationalism, that was another thing that I didn't ask you about, but was implicit in my thinking. Where does classical liberalism sit with respect to the question of nationalism and ethnic identity and all that? Anyway, I'm filibustering. I'm not answering you. That's for another conversation, I think, Emily. We should have another conversation.
I would like that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, in reading and looking back at some of Sowell's work on his questions of affirmative action, and some of his kind of discussions about stigmatization, and kind of some of the perverse outcomes associated with policies that are attempting to serve as a corrective for some of these historical injustices. I actually read a lot of similarity between the two of you in terms of your focus on the importance of culture as an important factor that needs to be taken seriously and put at the forefront of some of these analyses. Although you engage with that question in very different ways, I read a lot of your work about kind of, relations before transactions as kind of putting forward this notion that cultural institutions matter and they need to be kind of taken account of. So I'd be curious, maybe in another conversation, we can talk a little bit about that. But I see some of your work as being, actually in parallel and kind of, at least not in direct conflict with some of the ideas that Sowell's putting forward.
I think you're right. And that's going to be a theme in the lecture that I give at that conference coming up in October, I'm pretty sure. And I appreciate the implicit compliment in your remark. And I think Sowell was right. I didn't think so at the time when he was publishing his works about affirmative action, but I think in retrospect, it's very clear that he was right about that. And you're right that his emphasis on culture, which of course is not in any way restricted to the United States and the question of African Americans and inequality, the legacy of slavery, but which is a generic observation he has to make about social organization and disparities in a global context, is fundamentally on the right track. And you're right that in my own humble efforts to try to get my head around the persistence of racial inequality, the idea that people's habits, norms, practices, relationships, connections, ideals, that the informal institutions that grow up around family and so on is a fundamental part of the story. And that's very much in keeping with the view that Tom Sowell expounds in his many books on this subject. So we're fellow travelers, or more than that, and I'm happy to be able to say that, notwithstanding the fact that I'm not yet a card-carrying classical liberal. But Emily, thank you so much for giving me your time this morning. Emily Skarbek, Associate Research Professor of Political Economy, my colleague at Brown University, my friend. And I'm very happy that we had a chance to have this preliminary conversation. I'll invite you back in due course for us to continue talking to each other.
This was great, Glenn. Thank you so much.